Today you will learn that even though World War II didn't officially start until 1939, the seeds of World War II were sown with the ending of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. The Great Depression and isolationism will help give rise to dictatorships across the world. The fear to start another world war will lead to the policy of appeasement and strengthen these regimes, which will eventually lead to the start of World War II. The first cause of World War II was the Treaty of Versailles. The peace treaty ending World War I caused more problems than it solved and laid the basis for World War II. Several new nations were carved from old European empires. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland were formed from land lost by Russia. Czechoslovakia and Hungary were formed out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The treaty created new weak nations without any regard to culture. The Treaty of Versailles would blame Germany for the war. They would have to pay huge reparations and be disarmed. As you can see from the map on the left, France wanted to create a buffer zone between them and a German army. The land around the Rhine River would be completely demilitarized. Germany would also be bitter over the lands lost to Denmark in the north, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Lithuania to the east. Germany and the Central Powers would lose their colonies to France and Britain. Even though Japan and Italy were part of the Allied powers, they were not rewarded at all. The Treaty of Versailles led to an air of pessimism and disillusionment. People believed there would be another war. The second cause of World War II was isolationism. This cartoon shows how Americans felt about European conflicts. It shows the United States as the Titanic, trying to avoid the icebergs. We all know what happened next. Americans feared those issues might sink the US and drag them into another conflict. Just like the Europeans, Americans were disillusioned with World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars. We were saving the world for democracy, but it didn't end up that way. The League of Nations was the main part of the Treaty of Versailles for President Wilson. It was set up to keep the peace and avoid future war. For the US to have continued economic growth, world stability was required. To accomplish this goal, the US participated in several world disarmament conferences. In 1921, the Washington Naval Conference was called by President Harding and was successful in limiting the number of large warships and providing for a 10-year ban on the building of battleships. It involved 9 nations from around the world. It tried to stabilize the size of naval powers and resolve conflicts in the Pacific. 1 year later, the 9-Power Treaty was signed by all attendees of the Washington Naval Conference. This agreement intended to make the open door policy international law, keeping China open to international trade. Unfortunately, it lacked any real rules regarding enforcement, so when it was violated by Japan in 1931, no punishment occurred. It did not provide a deterrence to any illegal action in China. The Kellogg-Briand Pact renounced the aggressive use of force to achieve national ends. Almost every nation in the world signed it, but it proved ineffective since it permitted defensive wars and failed to provide for taking action against any violators of the agreement. The Secretary of State Charles Evan Hughes helped organize American peace initiatives to avoid naval arms race between the United States, Great Britain, and Japan. He would later serve as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Senator Nye from North Dakota formed a committee in 1936 to investigate the actions of bankers and weapons makers from 1914 to 1918. The Nye Report, as it was called, convinced millions of citizens that the bankers who had lent money to the European allies had been the merchants of death and had tricked the country into war because they wanted to make a profit at any cost. This will become the basis of U.S. foreign policy as Europe and Asia get closer to conflict. The Nye Committee led to the America First Committee. It was the leading isolationist group that fought to prevent U.S. entry into World War II. At its peak, it had 800,000 members, including future President Gerald Ford. Its most prominent spokesperson was celebrity Charles Lindbergh, who was very critical of FDR's foreign policy at the end of the 1930s. The organization disbanded shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack. Another cause of World War II was the worldwide depression of the 1930s. The Great Depression wasn't only a problem in the United States. Millions of Germans lost their jobs and became homeless. The unemployment rate in Germany rose to as high as 30%. Because of this, many Germans began voting for the Nazi Party. Along with the victims of the Depression, bankers, owners of large corporations, and the military began to support Hitler. He was elected leader of Germany in January of 1933. Another reason Germany struggled during the Depression was a concept known as hyperinflation. The value of the German mark fell drastically during the Great Depression. What cost 1 mark in 1928 would cost 1 trillion marks by 1932. The children in the photo are stacking bricks of money. Sometimes it was cheaper to burn your money than buy firewood. The effects of the Depression were severe on the German people and encouraged many Germans to vote for Hitler. Notice in the chart at the top left that Germans began voting for the Nazis in large numbers by 1930, but it wasn't until 1933 that they had enough votes to take over seats in the German parliament. The graph on the right illustrates how, as unemployment rose, so did votes for Hitler. The people wanted a change. They wanted someone who promised to bring them back to glory. The fourth cause of World War II was the rise of dictatorships. We will begin with the Soviet Union. In Russia, hopes for a democracy gave way to civil war, resulting in the establishment of a communist state called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, or just the Soviet Union. When Joseph Stalin came to power, he took complete control of the country and made agriculture and industrial growth the prime economic goals of the USSR. By 1937, Stalin was able to transform the USSR from a backwards rural country into the second largest industrial power in the world. This is appropriate since Stalin means man of steel in English. The US was number one. In his drive to purge or get rid of anyone who threatened his power, Stalin had 8 to 13 million of his own people killed. By 1939, he had established a totalitarian government. While Stalin was consolidating his power in the Soviet Union, the Italians were dealing with their own economic depression in 1922 and were worried that communists might take over their country too. This gave rise to another totalitarian, Benito Mussolini. Amid growing violence and chaos in Italy, King Victor Emmanuel dissolved parliament and held elections, where Mussolini was elected to parliament. In October of 1922, he demanded the government turn control over to him. King Emmanuel dissolved the government and asked Mussolini to form a new one. He became known as Il Duce, or the leader. He was the first to create a fascist country. He declared himself dictator in January of 1925. Fascism is a form of far-right authoritarian nationalism characterized by dictatorial power, suppression of opposition, and strong control of society and the economy. Fascism stresses pride in the nation and places the interests of the state above those of the individual. To strengthen the nation, fascists argued that power must rest with a single strong leader and a small group of devoted party members. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had followed a similar path to power as Mussolini. Germany's Great Depression began right after World War I. It was in this chaotic atmosphere that a jobless Hitler joined the nationalist social. Nazism was based on extreme nationalism. He wanted to unite all German-speaking people into a great German empire. This new empire would need more resources, so Germany would need to expand. We call this Lebensraum. To Hitler, the final part of Nazism was racial purification. Hitler believed that blue-eyed, blonde-haired Aryans formed the master race. All other inferior races had to serve the Aryans. Once elected to power, Hitler replaced the democratic Weimar Republic with his Nazi Third Reich. He claimed it would last for 1,000 years.